Hello, everybody. This is Fernando for the latest 20 things you didn't know about video. All right, let's go ahead and let's do another entry here. This one yet again on a subject I've talked about before in the past, but again, these videos are a great way to re-talk about these subject matters, talk about new interesting facts, new interesting trivia, and then give my own thoughts and opinions on them too. This is something that I've featured before on my Ghosts and Spirits side. It has to do with the Amityville horror. Yes, indeed, you have indeed heard that before here on this channel. But once again, I'm going to give 20 things you didn't know about the Amityville horror, and I'd love to hear what your own thoughts and opinions are on them too. And as always, these things are just in no particular order. So without further ado, let's go ahead and let's talk about number one here, and it has to do with this. One thing that the Amityville horror had was popular attention. Unfortunately, this did not go well with later homeowners and those in the surrounding area. In fact, they didn't like all that attention. They didn't like all the tourists and all the visitors that came about. So much so, in fact, that they ended up changing the address of the home from 112 Ocean Avenue to 108 Ocean Avenue. This was again a way to try to thwart visitors. And on top of that, the quote-unquote evil eyes, the windows that the house had that made it look like it was a set of evil eyes looking straight at you, this was renovated to remove the eyes so that way it could help try to get people away from visiting that location. Of course, it was just as easy to look, find it on the street because it still has its own distinctive style. But to this day, the neighbors do not like visitors. It's best if you're going to go down there to just be brief, take your quick selfie, and then get out of there. Otherwise, you may be considered trespassing if you're going around that location. Number two is this. Everything associated with the Amityville horror came from one fateful night. This occurred on November 13th, 1974. That's when Ronald DeFeo shot and killed all 6 of his family members, which included his 2 parents and 4 siblings. All of them were killed with a .35 caliber rifle. What's baffling people even to this day is this. All of them were basically killed in their sleep. So you would think that if this is happening, let's say one person is getting murdered in one room, another in another, you would think that this would wake people up, right? Like they would hear the noises and then they would move about and then try to save themselves. But no, all of them were found dead. All of them were practically sleeping when they were killed, and all of them were found lying face down. Nobody was found to be sedated. Nobody was found to be restrained as well. Also, none of the neighbors heard any of those gunshots. So again, it just baffles people to this day how that happened. If you wonder what happened later on to that day, Ronald DeFeo, in a sick and twisted way, just decided to pretend like it was all normal. He even went to work that day, and then it was only afterward, that's when he ran into a bar, yelled at the top of his lungs that he believed his parents were shot. This in turn brought some people over. He was trying to play it obviously like it wasn't him, but eventually police came by too as well, and that's when they found everyone was deceased, and then that's when the investigation started. Number 3 is this. There are multiple versions as to why Ronald DeFeo said those deaths occurred. However, all of them were easily thwarted, either through interrogations or subsequent outside investigations or even his own quote-unquote confessions. He just kept changing his story. So in one case, it was this. He stated it was tied to a mafia hit. In another case, he stated that they were actually linked to voices that he kept hearing, voices that sounded like his family members, that they were plotting against him, and so he had to just strike against them. And then in another one is this. Apparently, there was a mysterious second killer that was involved. No one, though, has ever seen this stranger, whoever that is. No name is indicated to them. And yet, in another theory is this, is that the killer, one of them was actually the sister, one of the sisters, in other words, of the family. It was Ronald DeFeo's sister, but that he in turn ended up killing her after seeing what she had done, and he tried to take cover for it. Again, no evidence of any of those items are found to this day. And because of his stories changing through time and through prison, he's now deceased actually. Some of those allegations also included that he killed them to claim insurance money. Eventually, though, he confessed to everything, finally stating at one point that he did indeed commit the murders. And this was because his parents were abusive to him and he was high and drunk at the time of the killing. Number 4 is this. After those killings, it took a little while, 13 months in fact, for the house to be sold. Eventually it did get sold at a bargain basement price, $88,000 at that time, and it was sold officially to the Lutz's family. This was the Lutz's family that you're looking at now. They were the ones that moved into the house. They were the ones that eventually had the Amityville horror happen to them, all those supernatural occurrences. When they asked about the bargain price and why that was happening, it was the real estate broker that eventually told them it was because of the murders. They just hadn't known at the time, that's the house that the murders were involved in. That real estate broker asked them if that was going to be an issue, but they stated no. And so officially they moved in on December 18th, 1975. In fact, the way that the house had the infamy of the murders tied to him, that the furniture there from the DeFeos was still there, and they ended up buying it. The Lutzes did all of the furniture there for just $400 because of the situation again involving those murders. Number 5 is this. Even though they moved in on December 18th, 1975, it was only 28 days later, so sometime in January of 1976, that they literally ran out the door. They ran out the door and never looked back. This was all again tied to the paranormal / supernatural activities that made up the Amityville Horror. This was all detailed in their best-selling book, The Amityville Horror, that was released in 1977. I'll talk about more of those incidences here in just a moment, but the book was an absolute success. In fact, if you're wondering how many copies it sold over 10 million copies altogether. I'm sure that number is much higher now too. I've read the book as well. I've listened to the audiobook as well. It is pretty creepy stuff. You definitely, when you read it, if you read it at night, you're going to start questioning some of the things surrounding you. So it is definitely a good scary read if you have a chance to do so. Number 6 is this. The book was so popular, it eventually spawned a quickly made movie released just 2 years later in 1979, also called The Amityville Horror. This one featured James Brolin, aka that he was the father of Josh Brolin, Thanos, in other words, and then also Margot Kidder, the beautiful Margot Kidder from the Superman movies, aka Lois Lane. The film was a huge success. Just like the book itself, it used clever marketing and it used the success of the book to be able to make $86 million at the box office. That was also very, very huge, especially since the film itself was made for just under $5 million. On top of that, it became one of the highest grossing independent films of all time. This despite the fact that it received a bunch of negative reviews from critics. More on that in just one moment. And it has become a horror classic throughout the years. So people loved it, but despite what the critics said. And it even had an Academy Award, if you could believe that too, for Best Original Score. Number 7 is this. The runaway success of both the book and now the film eventually spawned a big franchise between both mediums. This includes no less than 7 books within the franchise. These books were prequels, some of them were sequels, 7 of them. It's hard to fathom that there's that much to talk about when it comes to this franchise, but there is. And if you think that's a big number, then check this out. The films are at least 20 plus closely related films to the franchise. Even to this day, I'm sure there's probably a new one that's being thought up as far as continuation of that franchise. As with the other first film, and these books and then there's also films were absolutely destroyed by critical reviews, but there's still interest overall in the franchise itself and the brand name. People still pay money for it, and that's not including the documentaries that have been produced, all those TV shows and episodes that feature information about it. Even now, with me talking about it here in this video. It just shows the interest that the Amityville Horror has to this very day. Number 8 is this. There is much criticism, however, associated with the accuracy of the Lutz's total story. There's two wild ways about it. On the light end, it has to do more with the misinformation or forgetfulness that the Lutzes had to the dates and events. It's almost like soft-hearted stuff. On the darker end, though, on the more nefarious side, it's associated with outright claims of fabrication, with the overall basis being money. So in other words, they faked the whole book itself in order to bank some money. The reason for this is this. The Exorcist, which also was a runaway success both in a book and a film format, was made just a few years earlier. And so this has been pointed as an inspiration for the Lutzes and others to create this book over quote-unquote bottles of wine. That way they could create this book, have it be a success, hope for the movie, which eventually did come out. They even lifted the title of the book from an H.P. Lovecraft title. Can you believe that? Like they basically changed it just a little bit and then made it that memorable title. So if one goes by that notion that even though there was much criticism associated with the accuracy of the Lutz's story, their output eventually created a huge success. Whether it was real or not doesn't really matter. They got the success they wanted and they got some of the money that they wanted too. Although I read somewhere as well that there was much dispute about how much money they got and they were kind of outraged on it too. So I might talk about that in another video, but that's at least another interesting angle too. Number 9 is this. Much analysis has been placed on the continued testimony of both George and Kathleen Lutz to the very last day of themselves, basically to their death. They maintained that there were indeed supernatural forces at play within that house. They never wavered from their claims. They even took polygraph tests for it as well. These polygraph tests indicated that they were not lying. Now, I don't know if this means that they were telling the truth, but at least they were still not lying. But other criticism and other analysis as well focuses on some of the items that the Lutzes mentioned in their book, from whether or not there were truly pastors that visited that house, to the weather that was described on certain nights, to the damages left by some of the supernatural actions, damages that others eventually stated, no, it's not there. We didn't see anything along those lines. To finally, stuff involving police, like in other words, phone calls being made and visits by police officers that show no history on there too. So again, lots of analysis, lots of criticism associated with some of the details that the Lutzes presented. Number 10 is this. The Lutzes' children have finally come forward and they stated some of their angles as well. Like for example, there was Daniel and then also Christopher. Daniel stated that he did see some supernatural events occur within the house. He absolutely stands by it. The other child, Christopher, stated that they also had creepy encounters too. There's a little bit of discrepancy though as to the overall number of evidence tied to the book. Like some of them I've read in one that they stated that yes, it did happen completely. Others I've read that they stated no, that a lot of the stuff was fabricated within the book, but there still was supernatural occurrences. But there was also this interesting angle. One of them mentioned that they theorized there was their dad, George, who helped bring some of the supernatural stuff over, as he had previously dabbled in the occult. So maybe it was because of his actions that it caused the Amityville Horror to happen. Number 11 is this. One of the most telltale leads as to the Lutz stated as to what caused the supernatural events, i.e. the Amityville Horror in the house, was this. The house was built on an area that the Shinnecock Indians used to abandon their mentally ill and dying. They basically left them there to die to the elements. And then once they died, it created this evil force within that land, and it in turn bled over into the house once the house was built over it. Another one ties into it being built over a cemetery, either some Indian cemetery or something else altogether. However, all of this has been rejected by local Native American leaders, and so far there is no evidence that is directly tied to these ideas. Number 12 is this. If one does go by the evidence that supernatural events did occur, in other words, what was presented in the book and the film are real, then here are some of the notable ones that did occur during that timeline. Right during their initial move-in on December 18th, 1975, that's when they had a father who had arrived to perform a blessing. And as he was doing so, going room by room, flicking holy water here and there, that's when he heard a very masculine voice demand that he get out. This was prominently featured in the marketing of the film as well. This occurred specifically on the second floor bedroom. This used to be the former room of Mark and John Matthew DeFeo. This was their bedroom, in other words, and now is going to be used as a sewing room. Upon leaving the house, after he heard that infamous voice, he advised the Lutzes to never ever sleep in that room. But unfortunately for the father, he ended up having different bad things happen to him afterwards. For example, he had high fevers that would come and go, no explanation as to what or why that was happening. And then also he developed blisters on his hands. This was blisters that eventually started to form stigmata on them too. Number 13 is this. Another notable supernatural event that occurred within the novel and in the film itself, and in reality, again, if you go by this is all 100% true, involves the imaginary friend Jody. This was the imaginary friend that their daughter Missy ended up having within the house. According to her, she described it as being a giant pig, and this was a imaginary friend that Missy would converse with throughout multiple dates there in the household. In fact, it was so real to Missy that she even drew a picture of the pig, which you're looking at here. And then at other points of both the book and then also the film, it states that this Jody/pig was something physical to the point that it would make a rocking chair eerily move back and forth. George Lutz eventually saw what he described either a floating giant pig or a pig's head in Missy's bedroom on one night as he was standing outside. And then on another time period, that's when Kathy Lutz saw the pig in person, particularly two beady red eyes staring back at her from the window, at which point George Lutz threw a chair at the window itself. He heard this chair strike something. It must have been the pig itself because he heard a squeal, a very large, ungodly squeal like you would hear from a pig just basically crying in pain. And then he heard something crash there towards the bottom, and then when he ran to the window, that's when he saw what looked like a giant pig running back towards the boathouse that was located in the back area. And then on top of that, he saw hoof prints that this thing was creating along the snow along the way too. Number 14 is this. Even more notable instances of supernatural occurrences are this. There was apparently a statue of a lion, if I'm not mistaken, that ended up biting George Lutz on one occasion. On another occasion, there was some green slime that was seen floating basically towards them through a staircase, like it was almost creeping upwards through the staircase to them. They also frequently encountered cold spots throughout multiple areas of the household, cold spots that had no explanation of any sort. Kathy Lutz also mentioned that one time feeling an embrace. It was almost like a warm embrace by an unseen entity, and this entity also had this old lady perfume that was permeating from it. On yet another instance, one of the windowsills ended up slamming down on the hands of one of the children, severely causing damage to them. And then in another instance, there was the constant presence of flies that was located within the rooms, even though it was winter time when flies would not be around. These flies were constantly there. Number 15 is this, yet more notable instances of some of the supernatural occurrences. On one day, there was a door that was ripped off its hinges. Some supernatural force basically tore it off, even bending the frame in some of the surrounding areas. Interesting, because this was a 250-pound door and nothing had occurred that would have caused it to happen in the first place. In another situation, they constantly heard their front door sounding like it was being slammed shut with just huge force. But when they went down to investigate, nobody was there, and nobody would have been doing it because they were the only ones within the household at the time. And another weird situation, they kept having what sounded like a nightly march of a band there on the bottom area, like in other words, the first floor, and they were almost like tuning up their instruments, but at a very, very loud volume. I don't know why, but this causes me to be unsettled. Like the idea that you hear something like that downstairs when you know it shouldn't be there, and it has that specific noise. They would go down there and they would hear the marching noise, they would hear the band tuning, but when they went there, nothing was there. In fact, the dog was there and it was sleeping right in that area, but nothing had woken it up, even though they heard that happening. And yet in other instances, sliding drawers would rapidly open and then close, open and close, just for no reason whatsoever. Nothing that could explain these supernatural occurrences. Number 16 is this. Yet even more notable instances of other supernatural happenstances was this: a crucifix that was found turned upside down. On another time, Mrs. Lutz was seen as having grown old over several days, to the point where she looked like an old woman, even though she was a younger woman at the time. At other instances, George Lutz stated that he would wake up at 3:15 a.m. every night, having these violent thoughts about his family, which was, interestingly enough, the same time period that Ronald DeFeo killed his family, 3:15 a.m. that night. And then in other situations was this: the Lutzes would see, this was really creepy too, they would see a demonic laughing face appear in the fire of the fireplace. And the way it looked at them, it stared at them, smiling all evilly. It had half of its face blown off as well. And yet there it was, floating within the fire, and then just basically staring at them and laughing at them. Number 17 is this. It involves an infamous location within the house, the Red Room. If you go again by the notion that this is all 100% real, this was stated by the Lutz to have been a concealed room. And in fact, it was almost found by pure happen chance by Kathy Lutz. It was located underneath a stairwell. And when they went inside this room, one that they stated that it was previously not mentioned within any of the floor pans, that's when they found that it was just eerily painted red. They had no reason as to why it was painted red. It was the only room within the entire household to have been painted red. But it was said to have a very sinister feeling being inside it. On top of that, they stated that there was these strange odors that would come from the room. The dog as well would be nowhere near it. In fact, if they brought the dog to the room, George Lutz described it as having the most fearful action that he's ever seen the dog have in its life, and it would not come in at all. In actuality, though, if you go by the real notions associated with some of the later owners, it was actually a small storage space that was not concealed. In fact, some of the later owners stated that it was there, and some of the previous owners stated it was there as well the entire time. But if you're wondering where that infamous Red Room is now, it's gone. Later on, it was completely renovated in terms of that basement area that the Red Room was located at. And then afterward, it was removed, and it was basically turned over. Like whatever was renovated made it completely different and ran over, and then now it's just something else altogether differently. Number 18 is this. It has to do with the famous supernatural paranormal investigators known as Ed and Lorraine Warren. They paid a visit to the home in March of 1976, so about 2 months after the Lutzes fled the home. There they claimed to encounter an inhuman spirit residing within the household, and most infamously, they had one of their photographers set up an automatic camera, one that would take periodic shots throughout the night and take infrared pictures. And on one of those pictures, you're seeing this here. This has been known as the Amityville Ghost Boy. This was taken there on the second floor, as you can see by the stairwell. This has apparently been one of the best evidences of supernatural occurrences within the home, because no one knows who this boy is. It wasn't anyone involved with Ed and Lorraine Warren. And it's been described again as being a paranormal entity. In fact, it's been described as being the ghost of the deceased John DeFeo, who again ended up being killed by Ron DeFeo there within the household. Others state, though, that, however, it was one of the investigators accidentally being caught on film, and that there's no supernatural evidence linked to it. Number 19 is this. The house has gone through multiple different owners. That is a fact. And this is after the Lutzes had run out of the home. But interestingly enough, none of them, not a single one of them, have stated that they experienced anything paranormal within the residence. So whether, again, the Lutzes have been telling the truth one doesn't know. Again, they stated to the very end of their lives, to their death, that they did, but none of the owners afterward did on their end. But the home has encountered some weird selling markets. Like in one case, it was completely sold undervalued by several hundred thousands. In others, it was sold for much higher, for several hundred thousands as well. In fact, as of this video right now, it's currently being listed for sale once again at 1.7 million offers. $1 million? Can you believe that kind of offer? Here you have it there already with pending with 1.7 million. Someone is buying it for that price, which makes it the highest price it has ever been sold. So definitely quite a change when it comes to a few years ago. I actually foresee it being an Airbnb of some sort. It could easily have something along the lines of, I don't know, $500, $1,000, anything like that, maybe even more being asked on a nightly basis. And then that way, whoever's doing it could have some kind of profit afterwards. And then finally, number 20 is this. I talked about critics thrashing the movies and so on. Roger Ebert, one of the most famous critics of all, did not like the film. This, despite the fact that he even met George Lutz at a Los Angeles airport, had a beer with him as well. He described him as being a likable and totally believable guy, but ultimately he stated it did not transition into a good film and gave it a thumbs down altogether. And that's pretty much it. I hope everyone liked this 20 things you didn't know about the Amityville Horror. Let me know in the comments below if you have any others as far as other trivia, and I'd love to hear what your own thoughts and comments are too. All right, everybody. Thanks again as always. Take care. Bye.